Last week, the Telegraph in London quoted a top EU official who's calling for a United States of Europe. It's yet another example of a signature prophecy proclaimed by Herbert W. Armstrong for many years, and now it's making headlines. Today on the Trumpet Daily, we'll examine that story from the Telegraph and also review some of those prophecies that Mr. Armstrong proclaimed.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. We'll get to that Telegraph story here in just a second. I want to first refer you to the Trumpet Weekly. This is the issue that came out just this past Friday with a picture of Gutenberg and Putin on the cover, an important story by Mr. Brad McDonald. We referred to that back in the Trumpet Daily on Tuesday last week. So make sure if you haven't subscribed already that you go to thetrumpet.com and become one of 23,000 subscribers who receive that News Digest prophecy in the news right to their email box every Friday afternoon. I want to refer to one other story in this Trumpet Weekly before we get to that Telegraph story. It was by David Ignatius from the Washington Post, an opinion piece from last week on Iran's fingerprints in Fallujah. And we talked a lot about this last week, I know, but just to finish off with that story, at least for the time being. He writes in his opinion piece, Iran allegedly has been able to use Iraq as a staging ground for operations to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. It talks about how that Iraq now is the staging area for these Iranian troops and supplies that are on their way over to Syria in support of Assad's regime. I want to take you to a quote my father wrote back in 1994. This is now 20 years old, which is hard to believe. This quote that or this article that he wrote in the Trumpet in 1994, it's a quote that you can now see in the King of the South booklet. If you don't have your copy of that, go ahead and order that at thetrumpet.com as well. But my father says the most powerful Muslim country in the Middle East is Iran. He asked, can you imagine the power they would have if they gained control of Iraq? And of course the title of the article is Iraq about to fall to Iran? That's something that we were seeing way back when, as my father was writing about the head of the snake, or the king of the south, as it's called in Daniel chapter 11, and seeing that this emergence of radical Islam headed by Iran was coming on the scene. He could see where the nations around them, particularly in this Psalm 83 alliance, we don't have time to get into all of that, but these nations that would eventually fall into the Iranian camp. That has now happened. Back to this Ignatius piece, he says, this is from the Washington Post, the sectarian cleavage in Iraq has widened since the U.S. departed, with Iraqi Shiites pulled toward Iran. Sunnis were drawn back toward the jihadist orbit, especially after Syria lurched into civil war. So you know about the Sunni uprising there around Fallujah and in the Anbar province. But what Ignatius brings out in his piece is that really it's Iran that's pulling the strings there in Iraq. Again, I'll just refer you to that Trumpet Daily we did last week on where Americans died in vain. Go back and watch that, I believe from last Wednesday. A couple more quotes from the Washington Post. It says, but tragically, a new war to drive al-Qaeda from the Euphrates Valley is beginning just a few years after the terrorist group appeared to have been crushed there. Just a few years later, after it appeared to be crushed, the United States lost 4,486 soldiers in its occupation of Iraq, and about a third of them died in the Anbar province, that province where Fallujah is located. A third of our soldiers that we lost during that war in Iraq, and al-Qaeda was evidently crushed, as he says there in his piece, but now they've come storming back and they're raising flags over Fallujah. One last quote, he says, new Iraqi elections will be held in April. It's a mark of Iran's tactical skill that Tehran is said to be abandoning Maliki and searching for a new client. America is picking up the slack once more, supplying Maliki with advice and weapons. It says the Iranians, it must be said, notice this, the Iranians, it must be said, played the Iraqi game with a finesse and staying power the U.S. has never matched. We didn't have the staying power. We talked to you about this last week. Even when there was this big show of force after 9/11, as soon as the dust settled, as soon as the popular opinion of the world started to turn, then America pretty much abandoned ship and left it in the hands of Iran. Iran has won, basically. He brings that out. They play the game with finesse and staying power, and America has not. That Telegraph article that I mentioned at the top of the program, that's also referred to or quoted at length in this recent Trumpet Weekly. So as I say, make sure you become a subscriber there so that you can really keep an eye on the top stories of the week, every week, from all over the world. The title of this article is, "We Want a United States of Europe," says top EU official. This is from the Telegraph, January the 8th, and it begins with a campaign for the European Union to become a United States of Europe will be the best weapon against the Eurosceptics, one of Brussels' most senior officials has said. This is a top official in Brussels. The article says Viviane Reding, Vice President of the European Commission and the longest-serving Brussels Commissioner, has called for a true political union to be put on the agenda for EU elections this spring. It says, we need to build a United States of Europe with a commission as government and two chambers, the European Parliament and a Senate of member states, she said. That's quoting from Mrs. Reding. And then the article says Mrs. Reding's vision, which is shared by many, this is a vision that's shared by many in Europe. It says, which is shared by many in the European institutions, would transform the EU into a superstate, relegating national governments and parliaments to a minor political role equivalent to that played by local councils in Britain. That's quite an astonishing statement of what's happening behind the scenes there in Europe. The article talks about how there's this rising popularity across the continent, particularly in Britain, of Eurosceptics. People like Nigel Farage, who don't want the Union, who know that it's gaining too much power. And because of this rising popularity of Eurosceptics, as the article brings out, Mrs. Reding is calling upon, the few who are really solid and committed to this European Union project. She's calling on them to form the United States of Europe, irrespective of what the Eurosceptics might think, or even nations that might not want to commit to that. The article says Mrs. Reding's comments illustrate the growing gulf between a Europe committed to ever closer union and Britain, which is pushing to reduce the EU's powers. There's this growing gulf in Europe. I mean, you can see this iron and clay mixture. Of course, a lot of the clay is going to be moved out as that nation, that conglomerate of nations, downsizes to a much more efficient and stronger group of 10 kings, as the Bible prophesies. Now, going back to that comment about Britain, which is pushing to reduce the EU's powers, Mr. Armstrong warned for decades, as early as the 1950s and 60s, that Britain would not be part of this coming final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire, even as the British Prime Minister back at the time, Edward Heath, was ramrodding Britain into the economic community in 1973. Mr. Armstrong was saying Britain would live to regret that, and that ultimately Britain would not be part of this union in Europe this pink sheet. I just want to show you this. I've referred to this before, but this is something they used to send out with the old correspondence courses, Mr. Armstrong's correspondence course from back in the 1950s and 60s. My dad was a subscriber back then, but they'd send these letters along with it. You can see here it says, "A hot World War III is coming." A pretty strong letter that they included in those lessons that they sent out to their students. And Mr. Armstrong, in this letter, and of course in so many other booklets, articles, he warned of a resurgent Germany. He warned of the resurrection of that Holy Roman Empire in the heart of Europe. In this pink sheet letter, he talks about how Germany was responsible for both World Wars I and II, and he explained that after they saw that they were losing there in 1943, 1944, that the top German generals and scientists and industrialists, that they essentially went underground and made plans for the next round when they'd have another opportunity to become a superpower. And as he explains in this letter, the first step to acquiring that world domination was to form a United States of Europe. That's what Mr. Armstrong was writing back in 1955. That's a long time ago. And as I said at the top of the program, here we see those statements, those prophecies, making headlines today. Now you can see them in the Daily Telegraph. Quoting from this letter, it says, "We know," this is Mr. Armstrong writing, "we know how the United States of Europe will be used by Germany to attempt world domination." It says, "Prophecy shows 10 kings, 10 dictators will arise in Europe and give their power to Germany." Now this was the signature prophecy of Herbert W. Armstrong throughout his 50-year ministry. This was the signature prophecy. I mean, anyone familiar with his work instantly remembers what he said about Germany and about the United States of Europe. I just want to play you a short clip. This is from one of his radio programs back in the 1960s. I don't have an exact date, but you can get an idea from this short clip about just some of the things he was saying way back in the 1960s about this coming United States of Europe.
Well, greetings, friends around the world. Now, I've been telling our radio audience and readers of the Plain Truth that a political union of 10 nations in Europe would rise, resurrecting the Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages. I was predicting this even before World War II began. Not many believed it then. Well, let me quote to you what I wrote in an article in the Plain Truth of July 1935, 4 years before World War II was started by Adolf Hitler. I'll just quote a little out of the center of that entire article that shows what the article was saying and what it was talking about. Listen, quote, "Out of the present Italy is to emerge a reincarnation of the once great and powerful Roman Empire by an alliance of 10 nations within its territory." That was 4 years before World War II began. Biblical prophecy revealed that it would start as an economic movement, that it would bring an era of unusual prosperity to Europe. It did start in March 1957, when 6 European countries, West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, signed the Treaty of Rome, creating what was called the EEC, that is, the European Economic Community. It has been known, of course, as the European Common Market, and it came into being, actual operation, that is, on January the 1st, 1958. Immediately it began to bring economic prosperity to those 6 countries and has provided economic competition for Britain, for the United States, and for other countries around the world. For years, European nations have wanted to unite in a sort of United States of Europe. What they want is political union, but they've never been able to bring that about. While President de Gaulle of France lived, Germany would never have yielded to accept him as the political head of a union, including Germany, and the French would not accept a German. Long-range plans are already underway for a common currency in Europe, But other things are going to intervene in the meantime that I want to tell you about, and I predict that there will be a common currency a great deal sooner in Europe. Now, how did I know, as far back as 1927 even, that this coming United States of Europe would spring up in our time? I knew because it's revealed in biblical prophecy.
Now, as I said, Mr. Armstrong made those comments during the 1960s, and as he said on that very broadcast that you heard, he knew even long before then about this powerful 10-nation union that would emerge out of Europe. He knew back in the 1950s that when the European Economic Community was starting to form, that this was the very beginning stage of that final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. Mr. Armstrong knew that there'd be a common currency. He talked about this often in the 1950s and 60s, that there'd be this political union, and that ultimately it would be a military union as well. He talked long before the wall came down in Germany about East and West Germany uniting again. He talked about that before, long before 1989, when the world actually saw that wall come down. Now, today you look at Europe, this union, and there's, I think, about 27 nations in the union, 17 or so are members of the Eurozone. But look, as we've been saying all along, it's going to downsize. And we've talked recently even about how Russia is only going to accelerate this formation of that final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. Let me quote to you what Reuters had to say. This is actually an article from 2 years ago, November 27th, 2011. It says, senior French and German civil servants have been exploring other ways of achieving the goal, either via an agreement among just the Eurozone countries or a separate agreement outside the EU treaty that could involve a core of around 8 to 10 Eurozone countries. I was talking about how it could basically downsize and become more efficient and stronger as a union. And one idea that was being proposed then was to have this sort of core group of 8 to 10 nations. I mean, anytime you see that in an article or when you see headlines talking about a United States of Europe, those prophecies should come just ringing back into our heads if we're at all familiar with what Mr. Armstrong was teaching and proclaiming for so many decades. Now, if you want to read along, I just want to go through a few verses in Revelation 17 here before we conclude this prophecy in the book of Revelation that talks about that final formation of the resurrected Roman Empire. The 17th chapter here describes that seventh and final resurrection, which we're seeing happen right before our eyes. Now, you can go back to some of the other critical chapters of prophecy just to get the background or the context that you need for this one in chapter 17, like Daniel 2, which talks about the 4 successive world empires, that great image of Daniel 2. And, of course, the final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire over there is pictured by the feet of iron and clay, and then those 10 toes represent the 10 leaders or kings or groups of nations that are going to come together in these latter days. Daniel 7 also goes on and talks about those 4 world ruling empires, and it puts a little more emphasis on that 4th system, the Roman system. And then you can look at Revelation 13 as well, where the focus is more on our time today. It focuses almost exclusively on that Roman beast, which had its heyday, of course, centuries ago, and then even appeared to die. But with the emergence of Justinian and him declaring that the Pope had supremacy over this political, religious union, here it was again, the resurrection of that ancient system. And the Bible said there would be 7 of them. And we're now seeing the 7th rise before us. Revelation 17 here in verse 1, it says, "And there came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come here, and I will show unto you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters." And so here is a woman who symbolizes this great false church that's riding over or heavily influencing this political beast, this group of nations. It's an unholy union of church and state. Verse 7 says, "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns." So here is depicted a woman riding a beast, meaning the church will be guiding this political entity. Verse 8 says, "The beast that you saw was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is." It's some awkward language at first glance, but basically if you understand anything about the history of Herbert W. Armstrong's work, and you know when he came on the scene, really right in that World War II era, just before that, and then through the World War era and afterward, he came on the scene when that 6th head, that 6th resurrection was rising. He lived through that 6th resurrection. And then he prophesied about the 7th. He just didn't live long enough to see it himself. He died in 1986, as many of you know. But he certainly talked about where we are today, about how that after World War II, those top German industrialists and generals and politicians and so on went underground, biding their time, waiting for the next opportunity, the 3rd round. Verse 10, it says, "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. 1 is, 5 had come and gone. 1 was there when Mr. Armstrong came to understand this, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space." Another would come in the future, even after Mr. Armstrong's work. And when it would emerge onto the scene, it would last for just a short time. The Great Tribulation is just a 3.5-year period. And really, the full strength of that Roman Empire will be quite a force to be reckoned with during the first 2.5 years of that tribulation. That's a very short space. 2.5 years or so. Verse 12 says, "And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast." This refers to the coming United States of Europe. I say coming, really it's already here. There's some shuffling that remains to be done, but that's referring to the United States of Europe. 10 horns as part of that 7th head, that 7th resurrection. And these are not successive horns or kings that rule. These are contemporaneous. They're the same as the 10 toes referred to in Daniel 2, as I said a moment ago. 10 heads of state in Europe, 10 groups of peoples, 10 nations perhaps. Somehow or another, there's going to be 10 heads, 10 kings that come together and give their power to this beast. Verse 13 says, "These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast." I mean, there's going to be unity there. Leadership coming from a great church. Leadership coming from an emperor rising out of the heart of Europe, right there in Germany. And then all the strength and power that they need to dominate the world for a short time. Verse 14 says, this is what it ultimately leads to, "These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." You see, it's all building toward this, toward the return of Jesus Christ, when the nations of this world, not just in Europe, but all over the world, will turn and aim their wrath at the glorious returning Jesus Christ to this earth. He won't be welcomed. He's not going to be received with open arms. The nations of this earth are going to fight against him and fight against his saints. You can see those saints referred to right there in verse 14. I mean, there are God's people right in the center of all these prophecies that we've been telling you about for many years, that Mr. Armstrong told us about for many decades. And now you can log on to the Daily Telegraph website and see headlines like we saw last week. It's amazing to see what's happening. This booklet here, Who and What is the Prophetic Beast, goes into quite a lot more detail. We just kind of hit a few high spots on Revelation 17. But really those 4 key chapters, Daniel 2 and 7, and then Revelation 13 and 17, all 4 of them are expounded upon in this wonderful little booklet. So make sure that if you don't have this, you can get this right now. You can download it at thetrumpet.com, but you can also find a place there in the literature library at thetrumpet.com where you can order a free copy of this, a hard copy that we'll send to your mailbox. So go to thetrumpet.com and make sure that you get Who or What is the Prophetic Beast. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time on the Trumpet Daily.